The wind came across the open ground for 3 days before anyone in the valley admitted they were afraid of it. It did not howl. It did not need to. It simply pressed, low and steady, against every wall that stood alone on that prairie. And by the 3rd morning, most of those walls had begun to lean into it, just slightly, the way a man leans into an argument he already knows he is losing. At the Halverson place, the wind found the cabin the same as it found every other cabin for 20 miles. It found the gaps in the log joints. It found the seam under the door. It found the thin place in the roof where the sod had worn down to almost nothing. And then it found something it had not found anywhere else. It found a wall that was not made of logs at all. A line of young trees, bare of leaves, stood shoulder to shoulder about 60 paces from the cabin door. They had been there less than 2 years. They were not tall. They were not thick. A man could have put his hand around most of the trunks and closed his fingers. The neighbors had laughed at those trees more than once. A rancher who had worked that same ground for 11 years had said, in front of half the general store, that a man might as well plant fence posts and pray for shade. Trees did not stop wind, he said. Wind did not care about trees. But on the 3rd morning of that particular storm, when a boy from the next claim rode out to check on the Halverson family, half expecting to find the cabin buried to the eaves, the way 3 others already were that week, he found something he did not have words for at first. He found a path. Not a shoveled path. Not a cleared path. A path the snow itself seemed to have decided not to fill, running straight from the barn to the cabin door, while every open stretch of ground around it lay drifted chest-deep and hard as stone. He sat on his horse for a long moment before he knocked. Nobody in that valley could explain, not yet, why a man who could not afford enough lumber to finish his own roof had spent 2 summers digging holes for trees that gave no shade, bore no fruit, and by every account should have done nothing at all against a wind that had already proven it could bury barns. What they did not know was that the answer had nothing to do with the trees stopping the wind. It had to do with something the wind was never able to stop doing, no matter how hard it tried. If you are watching this from somewhere the wind still finds a way in, tell us where you are tonight. These are the kinds of stories that stay alive only because people keep passing them on. And if frontier stories like this one matter to you, subscribing helps keep them from being forgotten. 2 years before that storm found a path it could not fill, Anders Halverson stood at the edge of his own wheat field and watched part of his claim leave without him. It did not leave all at once. It left the way most losses on the prairie left, in a manner so slow that a man could almost convince himself nothing was happening at all. A thin brown haze lifted off the plowed ground every time the wind picked up, and drifted east, and did not come back. By the 3rd week of that particular autumn, Anders had stopped pretending he did not notice. His neighbors were bringing in wheat that stood as high as a man's waist. His own stood uneven, thin in patches, as though something invisible had been quietly taking a share of it since spring. He walked the rows some evenings with his hand low, letting the heads brush his palm, counting what should have been there and was not. Kirsten watched him from the doorway more often than she said anything about it. She had married a man who read the ground the way other men read scripture, slowly and out loud, and she had learned there was no use interrupting him while he was doing it. Their claim sat on some of the most exposed ground in the county, a long open shelf with almost nothing standing between it and whatever the sky decided to send. The land agent who had sold it to them, a brisk, not unkind man named Colby, had called it good level ground, easy to plow. He had not mentioned that level ground on the open prairie also meant nothing to stop what the wind carried across it, whether that was topsoil in October or snow in January. Anders had grown up on a narrow farm above a Norwegian fjord, where the mountains did half the work of keeping a house standing, and the forest did most of the rest. He had never once, in 20 years there, watched his own soil simply lift up and travel somewhere else. He had never had to. That evening, he found Eli, not yet 6 years old, crouched at the edge of the yard, trying to build a small wall out of loose dirt to keep the wind from scattering a handful of dry grass he had gathered. The wind undid it in under a minute. The boy built it again. The wind undid it again. Anders did not laugh at him. He crouched down beside him instead, and for a long moment he simply watched the same wind that was slowly stealing his living undo his son's small, stubborn wall, over and over, without once seeming to tire of the work. He was still crouched there when the idea first found him. Not as a plan yet, only as a question. What would happen, he wondered, if instead of building something the wind could knock down in a minute, a man built something the wind would need years to matter against at all? It took Anders most of that winter to turn the question into something close to a decision. And even then, he did not say it out loud until the ground had softened enough in spring to make it sound less like a dream and more like an argument. He remembered the fjord farm in pieces that winter, the way a person remembers a language they have not spoken in years. He remembered the birch trees that grew in a ragged line above his father's upper field, planted by his grandfather for reasons nobody in the family had ever fully explained. He remembered his father complaining more than once that the trees took ground that could have grown hay. He also remembered that the upper field, sheltered by those trees, was the one place on the whole farm where the hay never seemed to lodge flat under heavy snow the way it did everywhere else. Nobody had called it engineering. Nobody had called it anything. It was simply what the old man had done, and what his father had done before him, and the reasons had likely died with people long since buried. Anders raised the idea with Kirsten on a night in early spring, while Eli slept in the corner, and the fire burned low enough that neither of them needed to raise their voice. He wanted to plant trees, he told her. Not an orchard, not for fruit, a row of them, maybe two, close around the cabin and the near side of the yard, cut from the willow and cottonwood that grew wild along the creek bottom 3 miles east. Kirsten did not laugh, but she did not agree easily either. She reminded him, gently, and then less gently, that they had a house still needing a proper roof, a barn that leaned a little more every month, and a planting season that would not wait for a man to finish digging holes for saplings that would take years, if they lived at all, to grow taller than a fence post. Anders did not have a strong answer for her that night. He only had the memory of an upper field that never seemed to lose its hay, and a boy's small wall of dirt that the wind kept undoing without effort, and a growing conviction that a man could spend his whole life building things the wind could beat in a single afternoon. Or he could spend some of it building something the wind would need years to even begin to test. Kirsten finally said she would not stand fully against it, so long as the roof and the barn came first. And so long as he understood that if the trees died, as most things planted in a hurry on that ground tended to die, she did not want to hear him blame the soil for it. Anders made the trip to the creek bottom for cuttings on a morning in late April, and made the mistake, as he saw it later, of mentioning his plan at Colby's general store on the way back through town. He had not meant it as an announcement. He had only answered a plain question from Warren Doss, a rancher who had worked his own spread 11 years and had opinions about most things that happened on land within riding distance of his own. Doss had asked what the bundle of bare, dripping branches tied across Anders's saddle was meant for, and Anders, not being a man given to hiding much, had told him plainly. Doss had laughed before Anders finished the sentence. It was not unkind laughter, not entirely, and that was in some ways worse. Doss had the tone of a man correcting a child who had confused something harmless for something useful. He said the prairie had buried better plans than a Norwegian's willow switches, and that wind did not so much as notice a fence post, let alone a stick a man could snap over his knee. He said if Anders wanted a windbreak worth the name, he would need lumber and money, neither of which, as far as Doss had ever seen, Anders currently possessed. 2 other men in the store had laughed along, not cruelly, but easily, the way men laugh at something that costs them nothing to dismiss. Colby, standing behind the counter, had said nothing at all, which Anders found almost worse than the laughing, since Colby was the one man in the room whose opinion of his claim actually carried weight. It was Colby, in fact, who mentioned, almost as an afterthought while counting change, that the claim office expected to see continued improvement on the property by the following spring, if Anders meant to keep clear title to it. Fencing, structures, cultivated acreage. Colby did not say the words as a threat. He did not need to. Every homesteader in that county understood exactly what losing a claim looked like, and how little sympathy the land itself had for a man's reasons. Anders rode home with the willow cuttings across his saddle and the sound of Doss's laughter riding with him nearly the whole way, turning over in his mind not what a windbreak might cost him if it failed, but what continuing to farm unprotected ground might cost him if he did nothing at all. He began digging the following morning, close to the cabin, closer than he would later wish he had, because closeness felt, at the time, like the only kind of protection that made any sense to a man in a hurry. The ground near the yard had been packed hard by 2 years of boot traffic and wagon wheels, and the spade rang against it more than it bit into it. Anders worked in short, angry bursts through the first 2 days, the memory of Doss's laughter doing at least as much work as his own arms. Eli followed him the whole first week, carrying water in a dented tin cup that mostly spilled before it reached him, and dropping willow cuttings into the holes his father dug, one at a time, with the serious concentration of a boy who believed, entirely, that the trees would grow simply because he wanted them to. Kirsten came out most evenings to look at the line taking shape, saying little, though Anders noticed she had stopped mentioning the roof. By the 2nd week of May, a single row of young willow and cottonwood stood planted in a rough line about 20 paces from the cabin door, close enough that Anders could see it clearly from the window while he worked inside on the roof. Shingles Kirsten had not let him forget about entirely. He watered the row by hand every evening from the creek, a task that added an hour of hauling to days already stretched thin with plowing and building. He told himself some nights that he was not entirely sure why he was doing any of it, except that the alternative, doing nothing, had already shown him exactly what it cost. The saplings were bare, thin, and unimpressive through that first summer, no taller in most cases than Anders's own waist. Doss rode past the claim twice that season and said nothing about them at all, which Anders chose, for lack of a better option, to take as a kind of progress. By the time the first hard frost came in October, the row stood exactly where he had planted it, thin and leafless and entirely unproven, close enough to the cabin that a man standing at the door could have tossed a stone clean over the tallest of them. It would be another 2 months before Anders learned exactly how much that closeness was going to cost him. The storm that taught Anders his mistake arrived in December, not as the worst weather that valley had ever seen, but as weather ordinary enough that nobody thought to be frightened of it until it had already settled in for 2 full days. It began as most of them began, with a change in the light more than a change in the wind, a flattening of the sky that made Kirsten call Eli in from the yard an hour earlier than usual. By nightfall, snow was moving sideways past the window in long, hissing sheets, and by the 2nd morning it had not stopped and showed no clear intention of stopping soon. Anders had expected, if he was honest with himself, very little from the row of young trees, that first real test. They were bare, thin, barely taller than a man in most places, and he had planted them for a future winter, not this one. What he had not expected was for them to make things measurably worse. The trees stood close enough to the cabin that the wind, meeting their thin resistance, dropped its load of snow almost immediately on the other side of them, directly against the wall of the house. By the second morning, drift had built against the door in a hard, packed bank nearly waist-high, and had crept up the north window until the glass showed nothing but a pale, featureless white. Anders dug the door clear twice that day, and twice more the wind refilled the space before he had finished putting the shovel away. The real fear came on the third morning, when Eli, sent to check on the milk cow sheltered in the leaning barn only 40 paces from the cabin, did not come back inside as quickly as he should have. Kirsten noticed first, the particular kind of noticing a mother does before she has fully admitted to herself what she is noticing. Anders went out into a wind that had erased the barn entirely from view, calling a name the storm swallowed almost as soon as he spoke it. He found Eli within a few minutes, turned half around near the edge of the drift the trees had built, disoriented but unhurt, the boy's small tracks already vanishing behind him as fast as he made them. Anders carried him back inside without a word, and did not trust himself to speak for some time afterward. That night, after Eli was finally asleep, Anders stood at the window and looked out at the row of trees he had planted with such certainty in May, now barely visible under the very drift they seemed to have built with their own hands. For the first time since the idea had come to him beside his son's small collapsing wall of dirt, he allowed himself to wonder whether Warren Doss had been right all along. The storm broke on the fourth day, leaving behind the particular exhausted silence that follows any weather a family has been afraid of. And it was in that silence, rather than in the storm itself, that the real argument finally happened. Kirsten did not raise her voice. She rarely did, even when Anders half wished she would, since a quiet argument from her tended to sit with him far longer than a loud one would have. She asked him plainly, while Eli slept and the fire settled, whether he understood that his trees had very nearly cost them their son. Not despite the storm, but because of exactly the thing he had planted them to prevent. Anders did not have an answer ready. He had spent 3 days digging a door clear of snow his own planning had helped put there, and he had spent 3 nights listening to wind that no longer felt like a distant threat, but like something that had walked directly into his yard and shown him precisely how little he understood about it. Kirsten reminded him, without cruelty, but without much softness either, that the roof still leaked in 2 places, that the barn still leaned further than it had in the fall, and that a man with a claim to prove and a family to keep warm did not have unlimited seasons to spend on an idea that had, so far, made the winter worse rather than better. Anders spent much of that week in a silence of his own, working through the barn repairs and the roof without much conversation, turning the failure over the way he had once turned over the memory of his grandfather's birch trees, searching for the piece of the picture he was still missing. He did not want to admit, even to himself, how close the idea had come to costing him more than a rancher's laughter. He thought of his father's upper field again, the one that never lodged flat under heavy snow, and for the first time he allowed himself to wonder whether the trees there had ever stood as close to the house as his did, or whether his memory, eager for an easy answer, had simply left that particular detail out. Kirsten did not tell him to give up entirely. She told him, instead, on a colder night near the end of that week, that she would give him through the following autumn to prove the idea meant something, and not 1 season longer, and that if it failed again in a way that put Eli at risk, she would not stand quietly by a second time. Anders took that as more mercy than he had expected, and more pressure than he had felt since the day he first stood watching his own soil leave the field without him. He spent the better part of January doing something none of his neighbors would likely have recognized as work at all, which was walking the open ground around his claim for hours at a stretch, watching not the trees, but the snow itself. He noticed, on a still morning about a week into that study, a low rise of ground perhaps 200 paces east of the cabin, no higher than a man's knee, where a thin scatter of native grass had grown a little taller and thicker than the ground around it. The snow near that rise did not pile directly against it the way it had piled against his row of willows. Instead, it seemed to lift, thin out, and settle gradually, a long, gentle drift trailing well beyond the rise itself, rather than stacking hard against its near side. He found the same pattern near a denser stretch of wild plum brush along the creek, and again near a scattered line of low hills to the northwest, that the whole valley simply called the Humps. In every case, the snow behaved differently around something loose, low, and somewhat open than it did around anything solid and close. It took him longer than he liked to admit before the pattern resolved into something he could actually use. The wind, he began to understand, did not care whether an obstacle was made of wood, brush, or stone. It cared how far away that obstacle stood from the ground it was trying to protect, and how much air was still allowed to move through it rather than around it. His row of willows had been planted close enough and thick enough that the wind, meeting it, had nowhere to go but immediately down, directly onto the ground just beyond it, which happened to be his own doorway. A wall built too near a house did not stop what the house needed stopped. It simply moved the problem a few feet closer. By early February, Anders had a rough plan sketched with a stick in the dirt floor of the barn, something Kirsten found him crouched over more than once by lamplight. Instead of one dense row close to the cabin, he would plant several rows, spaced well apart, the nearest of them a good distance from the house rather than close beside it, with deliberate gaps left in each row rather than a solid, unbroken wall. He would let the wind through. In other words, rather than trying to stop it outright and let it lose its strength gradually, well before it ever reached his door. Replanting began as soon as the ground allowed it that spring, and it demanded more from Anders than the first row ever had, both in labor and in patience, since staggered rows spaced well apart across open ground meant far more digging than a single line close to home. He moved the nearest row back a considerable distance from the cabin, closer to 60 paces than the 20 he had used the year before, and added 2 more rows behind it, each offset from the last, with deliberate breaks left every so often rather than planting the willows shoulder to shoulder in an unbroken line. Eli, older now by a year and steadier on his feet, worked beside him through most of it, no longer simply dropping cuttings into holes, but beginning to understand, in the plain way a child understands things, that the gaps his father insisted on leaving were not mistakes, but part of the plan itself. Warren Doss rode past twice that summer and said nothing, though Anders noticed him slow his horse the second time, studying the staggered rows for longer than a man entirely uninterested typically would. The real test came in late October, earlier in the season than anyone expected, a hard 2-day blow that was not the worst storm the valley had seen, but was enough to bury fence lines and stop a wagon in its tracks along the open road. Anders watched from the window through most of the second day, and what he saw was not a miracle. Snow still built up in places, drifted deep along one gap he had left slightly too wide, and crept further than he liked along the northern edge of the new planting. But the hard, immediate pile that had once stacked directly against his door did not return. The snow, meeting the first loose row, seemed to slow rather than stop, thinning as it passed the second row and settling well short of the cabin by the time it reached the third. It was not proof, not yet, not the kind that would have satisfied a skeptic like Doss, who remarked at the store not long after that one middling storm proved nothing a man couldn't credit to luck. But it was enough, watching Kirsten stand at the window studying the same unremarkable, undramatic absence of drift against their door, to make her say, quietly, that perhaps the trees deserved one more real winter to prove what they were for. The following winter arrived early and announced itself in ways the whole valley recognized, even if nobody could have said exactly how they recognized it. Geese left the county nearly 3 weeks ahead of the usual date. The creek froze thicker, and sooner than Anders had ever seen it freeze. Colby, weighing grain at the store in early November, mentioned almost in passing that his own knees, aching more than they had in years past, were rarely wrong about a hard season coming. Anders took the signs seriously enough to spend the better part of 2 weeks walking his staggered rows of willow and cottonwood, now well past a man's height in most places, looking for exactly the kind of weakness the previous winter had taught him to expect. He found one gap along the northern edge of the planting, wider than he remembered leaving it, likely widened by 2 years of cattle drifting through on their way to water. Closing it properly meant hauling and setting fresh cuttings into ground already half frozen, work that fought him at every turn. On one bitter afternoon, rushing to finish before dark, he misjudged the depth needed for a fresh row and lost nearly a full day redoing work he had already done once, cursing under his breath in a mixture of English and the Norwegian his father had once used for exactly this kind of frustration. Kirsten, watching him from the doorway more than once that week, no longer asked whether the trees were worth the trouble. She had stopped asking that question sometime during the previous winter's quiet, undramatic proof. What she asked now was whether the wood supply was sufficient, whether the root cellar held enough to see them through if the roads closed for a stretch of weeks rather than days, and whether Eli's boots, already tight across the toe, would last one more hard season. Anders answered what he could, and admitted plainly what he could not, and spent the last clear days before the ground locked entirely finishing the gap in the northern row, as best the frozen soil allowed. By the last week of November, the staggered planting stood complete as it was ever going to stand that year, 3 rows deep, spaced well back from the cabin, broken by deliberate openings everywhere except the one stretch Anders had just finished repairing by lamplight and stubbornness. He did not know yet whether it was enough. He only knew, standing at the edge of the planting on the coldest evening of that month, looking north toward a sky that had already begun to flatten out the way skies did before something serious arrived, that he was about to find out. The storm that came in early December did not behave like the one 2 winters before. It arrived faster, and it did not settle into a single, steady direction the way the earlier storm had. By the second night, the wind had begun swinging out of the northwest instead of the north, cutting across the planting at an angle Anders had not specifically prepared for. He noticed the change first as a sound, a slightly different pitch to the wind against the cabin wall, and stepped outside briefly into weather that stung any exposed skin within seconds. What he saw troubled him more than the cold did. Snow was beginning to curl around the western edge of his rows, rather than passing cleanly through the staggered gaps he had planted for exactly that purpose, catching instead along the newly repaired stretch on the northern side, the one section of the planting still thinner and lower than the rest. Kirsten noticed it before he said a word, watching from the window as a pale, low tongue of drift began creeping toward the barn from a direction the planting had never been tested against. Eli, older now and quieter in the way children become during storms serious enough that even adults stop pretending to be unbothered, asked once whether the trees would hold, and did not ask again after his mother told him, evenly, that his father was already outside doing what needed doing. Anders faced a choice that night he had not faced in either of the earlier storms. He could try to move the milk cow and the 2 hogs from the leaning barn into the cabin's lean-to, a task that meant working blind in a wind already stealing his lantern light within a few strides. He could attempt to reinforce the thin northern stretch in the dark, packing loose brush and fence rail into the gap the wind had found. Work that offered no guarantee of holding through a night already worse than the one that had nearly cost him his son. Or he could trust the 3 seasons of planning already standing in the ground and keep his family inside, watching, waiting, ready to act only if the drift reached the door itself. He chose to move the stock first, judging the animals the more urgent risk, and spent almost an hour in wind that erased the barn from view within 10 paces of it, working by feel more than sight. He did not attempt the northern gap that night. There was no time, and no light, and no certainty that anything he did in the dark would matter more than what he had already spent 2 years building. He came back inside near midnight, half frozen, uncertain whether the decision he had made was the right one, and sat by the low fire with Kirsten until the wind, sometime past 3 in the morning, finally began to ease. The wind dropped before dawn, the way it often did after spending itself completely, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows any night a family has spent afraid. Anders was outside before the light had fully come up, moving toward the door with the same tight, bracing caution he had carried into every storm since the first one had buried it. This time, the door opened freely. A little snow had gathered against the threshold, no more than a man might expect after any ordinary night, nothing close to the hard, waist-high bank the first winter had left behind. He walked out toward the staggered rows in the gray early light, and found what the northwest wind had actually done. Drift had piled deep and hard along the outer edge of the plantings, exactly where the thin northern gap had let it curl through, a heavy bank that would take the better part of the morning to clear. But it had piled there, well short of the cabin, well short of the barn, spent by the time it reached open ground close to the house. The animals were alive. The woodpile, stacked inside the innermost row, stood dry beneath a light dusting rather than buried under the kind of drift that had reached it 2 winters before. It was young Micah Voss, riding out from the next claim to check on families along that stretch of road, who found the cleared path first. The one this story opened with, running unshoveled and mostly bare from the barn to the cabin door, while every open stretch around it lay drifted chest deep. He sat on his horse a long moment before knocking, the way a person does when they are trying to decide whether what they are looking at is real. Word reached Warren Doss within the week, not because Anders sought him out, but because Doss's own barn, standing on open ground with nothing planted near it at all, had drifted shut for 3 days straight, and a man who could no longer reach his own stock had little pride left to spend arguing about willow switches. Doss came to the Halverson claim that spring, not for an apology, since men like him rarely offered those directly, but for cuttings, and for whatever Anders was willing to tell him about spacing and gaps and how far back from a house a man ought to plant if he wanted the wind to lose its strength before it ever reached his door. Anders gave him both, freely, and within a few years, staggered rows of willow and cottonwood had begun appearing along claims up and down that stretch of the valley, planted a little differently by every family who tried it, but built on the same plain lesson a Norwegian homesteader had learned the hard way, through one failed row and one long, uncertain night. Years later, when Eli was grown and had a claim of his own nearby, he planted his first row of trees well back from his own door, spaced and staggered exactly the way his father had shown him, not because he fully understood the reasons behind every gap, but because he remembered, clearly, a night when the wind had found every other wall in the valley, except the one made of trees his father had once been laughed at for planting. The wall had never been about stopping the wind outright. It had been about giving the wind fewer chances to arrive at their door with all of its strength still intact. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is a plausible reconstruction inspired by real frontier windbreak and shelter belt practices, not a documented account of specific individuals. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.